Hello and welcome to Through the Bible with Les Feldick. An Oklahoma rancher and farmer, Les Feldick has been teaching homestyle Bible classes for 20 years in Iowa, Oklahoma, and Texas. Les Feldick's unique style of Bible teaching has made the books of the Bible come to life. When Les is teaching, it's so interesting that people say time just seems to fly by. And now, here is Les Feldick.
And again, it's good to have everybody back, and we'll go right on into our second program of this taping session. And as usual, we like to welcome our television audience, and many of you are writing every week that you're just now catching the program for the first time. And so for a few programs, we're going to emphasize our tapes and our little books that are available. Keith Decker has sort of set up a good display for us. Keith does all of the preparation for the printer of our little books, and he has the publishing work here in Tulsa. And so just remember that all of the past programs are available on 6-hour videotapes on which we've put 12 programs. Now this goes all the way back to Genesis 1:1, and then a couple years ago they started transcribing the tapes, and so word for word it's now in print on the little booklets. And each booklet, of course, is corresponding to its individual tape. So we have book 1, tape 1, and so on and so forth. And if you're interested, why you write to us. You can buy one of each or as many as you care. Just give us a call and or write to us. In fact, a lot of times if people call, well, we just suggest that they let us send their order list, which gives all the topics and all the information in every tape, and then they can just sort of pick and choose. We've covered a lot of ground in the last 4.5 years, all the way from Genesis up. We spent 4 tapes, or 24 lessons, I guess, on prophecy in the middle of them. And then we went back and went through the Gospels. And now we've gone through the book of Acts, and now we're just getting into the book of Romans. So we'd like to have you turn with me, if you will, back to where we left off, Romans chapter 1. And remember now that after all that God has provided for us, if we'll just believe it, He also has to realize that for Christ and God rejecting mankind, even though His wrath has never yet been poured out, even though we know He destroyed the human race in the flood, we know He dealt with Israel betimes in rather strenuous ways, yet it was not God's wrath. It was disciplinary. And I think He's still doing that once in a while. But so far as the wrath of God, the world doesn't know what that is. In fact, maybe I neglected in the last half hour. Let's go back to Psalms chapter 2, because I think that's just about the first time that that word is used with regard to God dealing with mankind. In Psalms chapter 2, we have the word itself. And of course, we always use Psalm chapter 2 in prophecy because it's basically the outline of all the things that would happen concerning Israel, in simplified form, of course. But here in Psalms chapter 2, you remember, the early verses speak of Jew and Gentile rejecting the Anointed One, which speaks of crucifying Him. And then verse 4, He that sitteth in the heavens, that is the Godhead, shall laugh. In other words, that man should be so foolish. The Lord shall have them, mankind, the nations, in derision, total confusion, and boy, you can see it coming. And then, after they have rejected Him and rejected Him and rejected Him, and they have finally reached a point of complete confusion, but still think they've got all the answers, then He shall speak unto them in His wrath. See? Not in grace, not in love, but in wrath, and then He will vex them in His sore displeasure. All right, on your way back to the New Testament, just stop in Matthew 24, a portion that's well known. Jesus in His earthly ministry, of course, is speaking to the 12 there on the Mount of Olives. And here in Matthew 24, He says it so graphically. Matthew 24, verse 21. Matthew 24, verse 21. Speaking of that final 7 years of human history. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the world began. Now, I remember years ago when I looked at that, I thought, well, why did he say that when the flood was so catastrophic and so complete in destroying the human race? Well, because the flood wasn't his wrath. As I said in the last half hour, it was actually an act of mercy. They were instantaneously wiped off the face of the earth and they were gone. But you see, when his wrath is going to be poured out, it's going to be 3.5 years of things beyond human comprehension. That's what's going to be his wrath, and that's what's coming. The world is setting itself up for it. So he says that the great tribulation was such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. All right, now let's just go back to Revelation for just a couple references and see how Revelation speaks of this same period of time. Revelation 6. Revelation 6, and this is only the beginning. Revelation 6, verse 15. And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men. You know, I read an article the other day that some of our wealthiest people in America are beginning, I guess, to see the handwriting on the wall, and like rats leaving a sinking ship, you know what they're doing? They're buying up property down in the Caribbean islands. Some of them are buying a whole island, building what they hope will be safe escape for that which is to come. Hey, they can't hide. They are not going to be able to hide. Look what it says. And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the chief captains, the mighty men, every bondman, every free man, hid themselves in the dens of the rocks of the mountains. And they'll say to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, hide us from the face of him who sitteth on the throne, and from the, what's the next word? The wrath. Now I know Christendom has just been lulled to sleep with everything but any mention of the wrath of God. You don't hear it. People are afraid to talk about it. They don't want to hear it. But the book says it, that the wrath of God is coming. All right, let's look at another one. Verse 20 of chapter 9. And I didn't intend it to be this way, but this is going to set us up for the next verse in Romans 1 that we're coming to. It's amazing, huh? I just told somebody, you know, I don't plan any of this. It just sort of unfolds by itself. But look what it says in Revelation 9, verse 20. After all the death and destruction that has already taken place up to this point in time, the rest of the men who were not killed by these plagues yet repented not of the works of their hands, that they should not worship demons and idols of gold and silver and brass and stone and wood, which can neither see nor hear nor walk. Neither repented they or changed their mind about their murders, their sorceries, which is really drugs, nor their fornication, their gross immorality, nor of their thefts. In spite of all that has already been poured out, they're still not going to change their attitude. All right, let's go on to another one here in Revelation. Chapter 19. No, don't go quite that far. 14. 14. Revelation 14. And here we're at the end of the tribulation. We've had all these horrible, horrible events take place. Things that man has never yet experienced. And now we come to those that are surviving, that are in the armies of the world, all gathered around Jerusalem for that last great battle of Armageddon. And I'm not going to take time. I'd like to read all the way from verse 14, but I won't take the time. But come down to verse 16. He that sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. In other words, humanity. And another angel came out of the temple which is in heaven, he also having a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar who had power over fire, and cried with a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, thrust in thy sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for the grapes are fully ripe. Now, this is symbolic language, of course, of God gathering the residue of humanity that is still living, gathering them there in the Middle East, under military auspices, of course, and the gathering of the grapes into the wine vat is the gathering of these military people into that valley of Esdraelon, down the Jordan Valley, and all the low-lying areas of Israel especially, and they're going to be packed in, as I've said earlier, like sardines in a can, contrary to good military operation, but they're going to be forced by a sovereign God to just pack their men into these valleys. That's the wine vat. That's like putting grapes in the vat. And now the very presence of God is going to come and crush them as grapes in the vat. Verse 19, and the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth and gathered the vine. In other words, they're going to bring all their armies to the Middle East and cast it into the great winepress of the what? The wrath of God. The wrath of God. Now you see, God's wrath isn't being poured out tonight. We have no idea of what the wrath of God is going to do. Even though we can experience floods, earthquakes, volcanoes, that's nothing. That's nothing compared to what it'll be when the wrath of God will finally be released on Christ and God rejecting mankind. All right, now if you'll come back with me here in the studio to Romans chapter 1. We left off in verse 22, where ungodly men, men without faith, professing themselves to be wise, became fools. And I showed you what a fool was according to Scripture. He's the man or the woman who says no to what God says for us. And that is so typical. You know, whenever I look at verse 22 of Romans 1, I'm always reminded, and I've shared it with my classes for over 20 years, I can't help but always think of the Warren Supreme Court. You remember when the ex-governor of California became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? The biggest catastrophe that ever hit the United States of America. Because, see, out of that Warren Supreme Court came so many decisions that just wrecked our Christian fabric. The most notorious one, of course, is giving the criminal more rights than the victim. I don't remember the name of the law, but that came out of the Warren Supreme Court. I think Roe versus Wade, opening the door to abortion, I think it was still part of the Warren Supreme Court. Taking prayer and God out of the schools was all precipitated by the Warren Court. And I always have to think of those so-called brilliant, intellectual, robed men, thinking themselves to be wise, probably with more power than any other group of men in the world. And yet they'll come out with decisions that are as idiotic as a first grader. Why? This verse says it all. They have rejected what God has said. And consequently, they act and they respond as a fool.